The moment Evelyn Harper heard her own name spoken like a problem to be solved, something inside her went very still. Not the stillness of peace. The stillness of a woman who finally understands that the people she loved most have been planning her disappearance for months. She didn't scream. She didn't run. She pressed her back against the cold hallway wall and listened to every word that sealed her fate. If you're watching from your city, drop it in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Subscribe, stay until the end, and let Evelyn's fight begin. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, written in her father's handwriting, but signed with a trembling hand that no longer looked like his. Evelyn Harper read it twice at the breakfast table, then a third time standing by the window with the summer light cutting sharp lines across the paper. The words rearranged themselves no matter how many times she tried to read them straight. Transfer of estate holdings. Sole beneficiary amendment. Effective upon signature. Her father, Gerald Harper, had built the Harper Railroad empire from nothing. 30 years of work of dirt under his fingernails and early mornings and deals struck on handshakes when handshakes still meant something. He had told Evelyn since she was 7 years old that everything he built would be hers. Not her stepmother's. Not the company's. Hers. Now this letter was asking her to sign it all away. She folded it carefully and went to find her father. Gerald Harper's room smelled of medicine and something older. The particular stillness of a man whose body had started to give up before his mind was ready. He was propped against pillows when she came in his color gray, in a way that hadn't been there 2 weeks ago. The doctor visited every morning now. The curtains stayed drawn. "Papa." She sat beside him and took his hand. It was cold even in summer. "I got the letter." He turned his head slowly. His eyes found her face, and something moved through them, recognition and then something else. Something that looked for just a moment like warning. "Evelyn." His voice came out rough, thin. "I'm not signing it," she said quietly. "Whatever Margaret told you to write, I'm not signing it." He closed his eyes. "It's complicated, sweetheart." "It isn't." She kept her voice steady, even as her chest tightened. "You told me this was mine. You told me 100 times. Things change." "What things, Papa? What changed?" He didn't answer. His breathing shifted, the shallow, measured kind that told her the conversation was costing him more than he had. She held his hand a moment longer, then set it down gently on the quilt. In the hallway outside his room, she stood very still and thought. Her stepmother, Margaret, had married Gerald Harper 4 years ago, 14 months after Evelyn's mother passed. Margaret was elegant and precise and smiled at exactly the right moments. She had never been cruel to Evelyn openly. She had never needed to be. Margaret operated through paperwork, through whispered conversations with attorneys, through the slow and patient rearrangement of small details until the larger picture was unrecognizable. And Richard Vance, Evelyn's fiancé of 8 months, the man she had agreed to marry because he was charming and capable, and her father had approved. Richard had been spending a great deal of time in Margaret's company lately. Business discussions, Margaret said. Railroad concerns, Richard said. Evelyn had accepted both explanations because she had wanted to believe in the life they were building together. She stopped accepting explanations that Tuesday morning. She went downstairs quietly, moving through the large house the way she had learned to move through it as a child, staying close to walls, avoiding the boards that creaked, listening. It was a skill she had developed not from fear, but from observation. She had always understood more about this house by listening than by being told. She heard them before she reached the study. The door was not fully closed. Margaret's voice came through the gap in the careful, measured tone she used when she was certain she wasn't being overheard. "She won't sign willingly. We've established that." Richard's voice followed lower, unhurried. "Then we don't need her to sign willingly. We need her signature. There's a difference. And if she goes to an attorney, she won't have time." A pause. A sound like papers being moved. "The transfer needs to happen before Gerald deteriorates further. Once he's gone and she's contesting it in court, it becomes a mess. But if she signs now and then disappears before she can retract it..." "Disappears," Margaret repeated. There are roads through the Bitterroot Range that no one travels in storm season. A wagon accident. A woman traveling alone, perhaps distraught over her father's illness. These things happen. The silence that followed lasted exactly 4 seconds. Evelyn counted them. "Make the arrangements," Margaret said. Quietly. Evelyn pressed herself flat against the wall. Her heart was beating so loud, she was certain they could hear it through the door. She waited until she heard Richard's chair scrape back and move toward the far end of the room before she pushed away from the wall and walked. Not walked back toward the stairs. She made it to her room. She closed the door, and then she sat on the edge of her bed and understood with absolute clarity that she had approximately 1 day to do something before the people she had trusted with her entire life killed her for what she owned. She did not cry. There would be time for that later, or there wouldn't be. What she needed now was to think. The will. Her father's original will. The one drawn up 7 years ago by an attorney named Hoskins in the city of Bozeman would name her as sole heir. That document existed somewhere. If she could reach Hoskins before Richard and Margaret could stop her, if she could get to Bozeman and place herself under legal protection. She heard footsteps on the stairs. Too fast. Too deliberate. She was still sitting on the bed when the door opened without a knock. Richard Vance stood in the doorway. He was a tall man, well-dressed, with the kind of face that photographed well and gave nothing away in person. He looked at her for a moment without speaking. "You were in the hallway," he said. "I was checking on my father. His room is in the other direction." She met his eyes. "I took the long way." He stepped inside and closed the door behind him. The sound of the latch catching was very quiet and very final. "Evelyn." He said her name like a man recalibrating. "I know this has been a difficult time. Your father's illness, the pressure of the estate questions. Don't." The word came out flat. "Don't manage me, Richard. Not right now." Something shifted in his face. The performance slipped just slightly. "I need you to understand that what's happening is the right outcome for everyone. The Harper holdings are too complex for a woman alone to... Too complex." She stood. "My father built that railroad. I grew up watching him build it. Don't tell me what's too complex for me." "Sign the transfer, Evelyn." His voice had gone quiet in a way that was worse than loud. "Sign it, and this doesn't have to be unpleasant. And if I don't..." He looked at her for a long moment. "Get some rest," he said. "You look tired." He left. She stood in the center of her room and listened to his footsteps retreat down the hall. She had perhaps 4 hours. She packed what she could carry without anyone noticing a change of clothes. Her mother's locket, the small amount of cash she kept in a tin box beneath her floorboard, and the copy of the deed her father had given her privately 3 years ago, sealed in an envelope and pressed flat at the bottom of her travel bag. She went down the back stairs after midnight when the house had gone quiet. She did not make it to the gate. 2 men she didn't recognize were waiting at the bottom of the garden path. One of them had her by the arm before she had time to react. The other took her bag. "Ma'am," the first one said, almost politely. "Mr. Vance says you're needed at the carriage." She fought. She was not a woman who had ever fought physically, but she fought now sharp and sudden, using her elbow the way instinct told her to. The man grunted and tightened his grip hard enough to bruise. "Don't make this harder," he said. They took her through the back of the property and put her in a closed wagon. She shouted twice and no one came. The wagon moved before she could get the door open, and by the time the house was behind them, she was sitting in the dark with her hands gripped around the door handle and the road getting rougher beneath the wheels. She thought about the things her father used to tell her. "A Harper doesn't panic, Evelyn. A Harper assesses and decides." She assessed. She was in a wagon moving north toward the mountains with 2 armed men and no witnesses. She had no weapon and no allies. The deed was still in her bag, which one of the men had taken. She had herself. That was the full inventory. She sat with it. She sat. The road rose steeply. The air coming through the gap in the wagon door turned cold, faster than she expected. Summer in the lower valley was warm even at night, but the Bitterroot Range held its own weather. She could feel the temperature dropping as the wagon climbed, and a wind picking up that carried a sound she recognized from years of watching mountain storms approach from the estate's upper windows. This one was close. The wagon stopped. The door opened. Both men stood there, and one of them was holding a lantern. The light caught the tree line, and beyond it, only dark. "This is where you get out," the first man said. "You'll freeze out here," she said, not pleading, stating. "Not our concern, ma'am. It's the middle of the night. There's a storm coming." "Yes, ma'am." She looked at him for one more second. Looked at him the way her father had taught her to look at men who were doing something they knew was wrong, straight and steady, and without flinching. And then she climbed down from the wagon. The cold hit immediately. Not polite about it. The wind was already pulling at her hair, and the first flecks of something not quite rain, not yet snow, but the frontier's particular promise of both, touched her face. She heard the wagon door close. She heard the horses turn. She stood in the dark of the Bitterroot Range in her house dress, with nothing but what she carried on her body, and listened to the wagon retreat down the mountain road until she couldn't hear it anymore. Then she started walking. She didn't know which direction led to shelter or water or any human soul. She picked the direction that felt least like going back, and she walked into it. The wind built. The ground rose and fell under her feet in ways she couldn't see in the dark. Only feel grass, then rock, then a shallow creek she went into, halfway to her knee before she felt the cold water, and stepped back. She kept moving. She told herself she was not going to die out here for the benefit of Richard Vance's railroad ambitions and her stepmother's careful paperwork. She said it aloud once in the dark to the wind that wasn't listening. "I am not going to die out here." The storm arrived properly about an hour after they left her. Not a slow build, a sudden wall of wind and freezing rain that turned the ground treacherous and reduced visibility to almost nothing. She found a shelf of rock and pressed herself against it, arms pulled to her chest, and waited for a lull that didn't come. Her dress was soaked. Her boots were not made for this. Her hands had passed beyond cold into something that felt like burning, and then more worryingly into something that didn't feel like much at all. She slid down the rock face until she was sitting. She told herself this was temporary. She would rest for a moment and then continue. She was not certain she believed herself. The sound she heard next was not the wind. It was a dog, close, sudden, sharp. One bark, and then silence, and then the crunch of footsteps on frozen ground, moving toward her fast. A light appeared. Not a lantern. A torch. And then a figure came through the dark, and for one disoriented moment, she couldn't parse what she was seeing. A man tall, moving with the kind of certainty that belonged to someone who had never been afraid of the dark because the dark had always been his territory. He stopped when the torchlight found her face. She looked up at him from the ground soaked through and shaking so hard her teeth rattled, and she registered several things simultaneously: that he was a stranger, that he was armed, that his expression was impossible to read, and that his dog, a large dark animal standing beside him, had gone very still in the way animals do when they've located what they were looking for. He crouched down to her level. "Ma'am?" His voice was low, direct, no performance in it. "Can you stand?" "I'm not sure," she said honestly. He looked at her for 1 second, taking in the house dress and the soaked boots and the absence of any gear that would make sense for a person to have on a mountain in a storm. And then he stood and held out his hand. "Try," he said. She took his hand. She stood. Her legs went sideways, and he caught her arm without comment, steadying her the way a man steadies a fence post, practical and without drama. "There's a cabin," he said. 15 minutes from here if you can walk." "Can you walk?" "Yes." "You sure?" I said yes. Something that might have been respect crossed his face for half a second. "All right," he said. "Stay close. Don't fall behind." He turned and started moving through the storm, and she followed him because there was nothing else to do, and because she realized with some distant part of her mind that was still capable of assessment, she was already trusting him. In a way she had not trusted anyone in this house. Dress on this mountain, with her whole life dismantled behind her, She was trusting him because he had come to her out of the dark without being asked, and he had said, "Try," instead of "You can't." And that was more than anyone had given her in a very long time. The dog walked beside her the whole way. When the cabin door opened and the warmth of a fire hit her face, she felt her knees start to give again. The man caught her again, set her down near the fire, disappeared and came back with a blanket. "What's your name?" she managed. He paused, looked at her. "Caleb," he said. "Caleb Mercer." She pulled the blanket around herself and stared into the fire. "Evelyn Harper," she said. "And I need to tell you something, Mr. Mercer. The men who left me on that mountain, they're going to come back when they realize I'm not dead." Caleb Mercer didn't flinch, didn't look alarmed, just looked at her in that still measuring way he had, like a man who was adding up facts before he decided what to do with them. "Then," he said, settling into the chair across from the fire, "you'd best start from the beginning." Caleb Mercer was not a man who asked questions before he had answers. He sat across from her in the chair nearest the fire, and he listened. Not the way polite men listened, nodding at intervals, preparing their next words while you were still forming yours. He listened the way a man listens when what he's hearing matters still, and focused, his forearms resting on his knees and his eyes on her face the entire time. Evelyn talked. She hadn't planned to tell him everything. She had planned to give him enough to explain the situation without revealing more than was necessary, because she had learned in the last 12 hours that trust was a resource she had been spending carelessly, and she could not afford to spend it that way anymore. But something about the directness of him, the absence of performance, the way he simply waited without filling silence with reassurance she hadn't asked for, made the full story come out instead of the careful version. She told him about the letter, about her father's handwriting gone thin and uncertain, about standing in the hallway outside the study with the door not quite closed, listening to Richard Vance describe a wagon accident in the Bitterroot Range, with the same tone a man uses to discuss a business arrangement, because to Richard, that was exactly what it was. She told him about the two men at the garden gate, about the closed wagon and the dark road climbing north, about being set down in the storm and listening to the horses turn away. When she finished, she was shaking again, not from cold this time. The fire had done its work on her body. This was something else. Caleb was quiet for a moment. "This fiancé," he said. "Vance. Richard Vance. His family has railroad interests in the Southern Territory. He needed the Harper land grants to extend his father's line north." She pulled the blanket tighter. "I thought he wanted to marry me." "He wanted the land grants." "Yes." Another silence. Outside, the storm was working itself through the peak of its temper. She could hear it against the walls of the cabin, insistent, looking for a way in. "And your father," Caleb said. "You said he's ill." "He's been ill for 6 weeks. It came on quickly." She paused, let herself say the next part. "Richard had dinner with him privately every week for the 2 months before the illness started. I didn't think anything of it at the time. I thought he was building a relationship with my father." Caleb looked at her steadily. "You think it wasn't illness? I think my father was the healthiest man I knew 8 weeks ago. I think he signed a letter asking me to transfer my inheritance while he could barely hold a pen. And I think that if I had signed that document and then disappeared on a mountain road, no one would have looked too hard for answers." She met his eyes. "I'm not hysterical, Mr. Mercer. I'm telling you what I know." "I didn't say you were hysterical." "Most men would have by now." He held her gaze for one more second, then stood and went to the far wall, where a shelf held a tin coffee pot and 2 cups. He poured without asking if she wanted any, and brought a cup to her. "You said there's a deed," he said, settling back into the chair. "Your father gave it to you privately. 3 years ago. He had Hoskins, his attorney in Bozeman, draw up a separate instrument conveying the northern land holdings directly to me, outside the main estate documents." She wrapped both hands around the cup. "They took my bag. That document was in it." Caleb was quiet again. "Can you get another copy?" he asked. "Hoskins would have the original, if he's still practicing, if Margaret hasn't already reached him." She looked down at the coffee. "If he hasn't already been persuaded that the new documents are legitimate." That's a lot of ifs. Yes, she said. It is. The dog had settled near the firehead on its paws, watching her with amber eyes. She had the distinct impression the animal was running its own assessment of her, and had not yet reached a conclusion. "What's your dog's name?" she asked. Caleb glanced at the animal. "Scout. He found me. He finds things." He took a drink of his coffee. "He's better at it than most people." She almost smiled. The feeling surprised her that her face could still locate that particular muscle movement after the night she had just lived through. She let it pass. "Mr. Mercer." She set the cup down carefully. "I understand that I arrived here uninvited in the middle of the night, in the middle of a storm, and I have no reasonable claim on your time or your charity. I want you to know that I understand that. All right, but I also need you to understand that the men who left me on that mountain will come back when the storm clears and they find no body. And when they do, they will come up this range looking for evidence of what happened to me. And if they find evidence—" She stopped, started again. "I don't want to put you in danger that isn't yours." Caleb looked at her for a long moment. "Ma'am," he said, "I've been living on this mountain for 4 years. I know every trail in a 40-mile radius. I know where water runs in drought, and where the ground gives in spring. I know who travels through here, and I know who doesn't." He leaned forward slightly. "2 men in a hired wagon left a woman to die in a storm on my mountain. That makes it mine to deal with." She stared at him. "Get some sleep," he said. He stood and moved toward the far end of the cabin, unhooking a bedroll from the wall, and dropping it near the fire with an economy of motion that suggested he was not accustomed to guests, but was not bothered by them either. "You can have the bed. I'll take the floor." "Mr. Mercer, you need to sleep more than you need to argue about sleeping arrangements." He looked back at her. "And in the morning we figure out what comes next. Not tonight. Tonight you're alive and you're warm. That's enough for tonight." She wanted to push back on it. Habit. The instinct to manage her own situation, to maintain agency over what was happening to her. But her body was making its own argument, the warmth of the fire, and the weight of the last 24 hours pressing down on her simultaneously, and she was too tired to win against both. She took the bed. She didn't expect to sleep. She was unconscious within 4 minutes. She woke to the sound of Caleb moving around the cabin in the thin gray light of early morning. The storm had finished. The silence outside was the specific kind that comes after heavier cleaner, like the mountain had washed itself. She lay still for a moment and let herself take inventory of what was true. She was alive. She was in a stranger's cabin in the Bitterroot Range. Her father was dying in a house where the people around him wanted her dead. She had no documents, no money, no allies, and no plan beyond the next hour. She sat up. Caleb was at the fire working something in a cast-iron pan with the focused economy of a man who had fed himself alone for a long time and had made peace with the simplicity of it. "Morning," he said without turning. "Morning. Eat first, then we talk." She ate. The food was plain and hot, and she was hungry enough that plain and hot was better than anything she could have ordered in the Harper Estate dining room. Scout sat beside her chair and watched her with patient amber eyes until she gave him a piece of biscuit, which he accepted with considerable dignity. "He likes you," Caleb said. "He liked my biscuit." With Scout, those are the same thing. She set her fork down. "You said in the morning we figure out what comes next." "I did. I've been thinking about it." She folded her hands on the table. "The men who brought me up here, they work for Richard, which means Richard knows I was left on this mountain. When the storm clears and he gets word that no body was found, he'll know I survived. He'll assume I'm trying to reach Bozeman. He'll have men watching the road." "Yes. So I can't go by road?" "No. You said you know every trail in 40 miles. Caleb put down his own fork and looked at her directly. "I know what you're building up to." "Then you know I'm going to ask you to help me reach Bozeman without using the main road. It's 3 days through the back range, 4 if weather turns." "I know. You're not dressed for it. You don't have gear. You've never traveled mountain terrain. I know that too. She held his gaze. I'm asking anyway. He was quiet for a moment. Outside, Scout lifted his head and turned toward the door, a small, alert movement, and then settled again. Why Bozeman? Caleb asked. Hoskins, my father's attorney. If the original deed document still exists and Hoskins hasn't been bought, I can file an injunction against the transfer. Freeze the estate. Give myself time to get to my father before... She stopped. Before it's too late for him to speak for himself. Caleb's jaw tightened slightly. Just slightly. She noticed it. You think they're moving fast, he said. Richard is not a patient man. He moves fast and he covers his tracks. Every day I'm not in Bozeman is a day he has to consolidate what he's already done. She leaned forward. Mr. Mercer, I understand that this is not your problem. I understand that helping me puts you in a position you didn't ask for. But I am asking you to help me anyway because I don't have anyone else to ask, and because I believe that you are a man who doesn't leave a situation wrong when you have the ability to help make it right. The fire cracked between them. Caleb stood. He walked to the far wall, lifted his hat from the peg, and turned it once in his hands. 3 days, he said. Minimum. You do what I tell you on the trail without argument. Agreed. If the weather turns bad, we stop. No heroics. Agreed. And you'll need different boots. He looked at her feet. Those won't last a mile. I'll manage. I said you'll need different boots. He crossed to a trunk in the corner and opened it, pulling out a pair of worn but solid trail boots. They'll be too big. We'll bind the ankles. Better too big than what you've got. She took the boots without comment. They left within the hour. The first day was the hardest thing she had ever done in her life, and she had known intellectually that it would be hard, but knowing and experiencing were two entirely different countries with no shared border. The terrain Caleb moved through with loose-limbed ease required her complete concentration, every step a negotiation with ground that had its own opinions about where feet were allowed to go. She fell twice before mid-morning. Got up both times without waiting for help, which she could tell Caleb noticed, though he said nothing. He set a pace that was demanding but not punishing. He stopped when the terrain required stops. He told her what she needed to know, where to put her hands, where the ground was soft, where to step, and where not to, in short direct sentences that contained no condescension. Information, not instruction. She appreciated the difference more than she could have said. They didn't talk much on the trail. Talking took breath, and breath was needed for the climb. But when they stopped at midday, in the shelter of a rock outcrop, and ate what Caleb had packed from the cabin, something in the enforced silence became less awkward and more natural. The particular ease of two people who had already told each other the important things and didn't need to fill the space between. How long have you been on this mountain? She asked. 4 years. Before that, he was quiet for a moment. Army. Frontier scouting. What made you leave? Another pause. Scout had his head in Caleb's lap, and Caleb's hand moved across the dog's ears absently, the unconscious habit of a man who had been keeping his affections small and manageable for a long time. Got tired of watching things get decided by men who were nowhere near the consequences, he said finally. She thought about that. I understand that feeling. I reckon you might. They moved again. The afternoon light shifted as they climbed higher, and the air thinned, and the world got quieter in a way that was not empty, but full of sound that wasn't human, which felt she discovered like a relief she hadn't known she was waiting for. It was late in the afternoon when Caleb stopped suddenly on the trail ahead of her and held up one hand. She stopped. Scout had gone very still. Caleb turned his head slowly, listening. She listened too, though she didn't know what she was listening for, and then she heard it. Horses. Below them on the range, moving fast, more than one. Off the trail, Caleb said quietly. Now. They moved. He knew exactly where a shelf of rock that couldn't be seen from below reached by a lateral scramble that she made without fully understanding how her feet found it. They pressed flat against the rock and waited. 3 horses came into the visible section of the lower trail below them, moving with purpose. 3 men, not 2. The third she didn't recognize, but the first one, the one riding slightly ahead, she knew by his posture. Richard Vance. He had come himself. She pressed herself harder against the rock without meaning to. Every muscle in her body went rigid. Caleb was beside her, close enough that she could feel the stillness of him. Not the stillness of fear, but the other kind. The kind that came from a man who had been in situations where noise meant death and had trained his body accordingly. Richard's voice drifted up from the trail below, fragments, not full sentences, the wind taking most of it. Didn't survive that storm. Has to be sure. Nothing left to find. He was coming up to confirm. She understood with cold precision what that meant. He wasn't satisfied with leaving her in the storm. He had come to look for a body, and if he didn't find one, he would keep looking until he did. The horses passed below and moved up the far trail, the main access route, the one she and Caleb had deliberately not taken. They waited. 3 full minutes of silence after the sound of hooves faded. Then Caleb turned to her. His face was doing nothing dramatic, but his eyes had gone to a particular kind of sharp. He came himself, he said quietly. He doesn't trust anyone else to confirm it. That means he's scared. She blinked. She hadn't thought of it that way. Richard Vance doesn't look scared, she said. Men who come to confirm their own crimes personally are always scared. Confidence hires other people. Fear shows up. He looked back in the direction the horses had gone. He's scared because he doesn't know what happened to you, and he needs to know. He turned back to her. Which means you have more time than you thought. He won't move forward on the estate while there's uncertainty. She let that land, reorganized her thinking around it. He'll search for 2, maybe 3 days, she said slowly. He can't stay away from the city longer than that without raising questions. Right. So we have a window. We have a window. Caleb stood. We move faster now. She didn't argue. They made another 4 miles before dark forced a stop. Caleb built a fire small enough not to be seen from the lower trails, and she sat beside it, with her arms around her knees, and her mind working through everything she knew. In the order she knew it, arranging it the way her father had taught her to arrange a problem, not by emotion, but by sequence, one fact following another, until the shape of the whole thing became clear. My father's attorney, she said. Hoskins. Do you know Bozeman well enough to know if he's still practicing? Caleb thought. There's a Hoskins on Meridian Street. Law practice. Been there as long as I've been making supply runs. She exhaled. Good. That's good. Don't put all your weight on it yet, he said. Knowing he's there and knowing he's clean are different things. I know. She looked at the fire. But he drew up the original deed himself. He notarized it. If he's the man my father trusted, he'll know what a fraudulent transfer looks like. And if he's been paid, then I make another plan. She looked up. I always make another plan. Caleb watched her across the fire for a moment. Something in his expression shifted. Not much. The movements of his face were small and considered, but she had started to learn to read the small ones. Your father raised you to fight, he said. It wasn't a question. He raised me to think. She paused. The fighting I learned on my own. He almost smiled. The corners of his mouth moved fractionally in a direction that suggested a smile had happened somewhere behind the stillness of his face. Get some sleep, he said. Same arrangement as last night. I'll take watch. You need sleep too. I'll sleep in shifts. I've done it before. She looked at him. Mr. Mercer, you are spending your own time and your own safety to help a woman you met 12 hours ago in a storm. I want you to know that I am not taking that lightly. He was quiet for a moment. You didn't ask me to come, he said. I came because Scout found you, and I followed him. And I'm helping you get to Bozeman because what was done to you was wrong, and I don't sit well with wrong. He picked up a stick and turned it in the fire, a small, focused movement. You don't owe me a debt for that, ma'am. That's just how I'm made. She held that in her chest for a moment. Evelyn, she said. He looked up. My name. You keep saying ma'am. My name is Evelyn. He held her gaze for one moment. 2. "Evelyn," he said. Just that. Just her name spoken straight without decoration. She lay down near the fire and pulled the bedroll around her and stared at the sky through the trees, clear now after the storm, with stars punched through the dark, in numbers she had never seen from the estate windows. And she thought about Richard Vance moving through the lower trails, looking for a body that wasn't where he left it. She thought about her father's thin hands on the quilt. She thought about Caleb Mercer saying, "That's just how I'm made," and meaning every word of it without needing anyone to applaud him for it. She was on a mountain in the middle of the night with no documents, no money, and men looking for her. She was also, and this was the thing she hadn't expected, the thing that sat in her chest alongside the fear and the fury and the grief, she was also not alone. She closed her eyes. Tomorrow they would move. Tomorrow she would start taking back what was hers. Tonight she let herself have this, the fire, the stars, the sound of Scout breathing near her feet, and the quiet certainty of a man keeping watch who had decided for reasons that were entirely his own that she was worth watching over. That was enough to sleep on. And in the lower trails, 3 horses moved through the dark, looking for a woman they were not going to find, and Richard Vance, for all his careful planning, for all his railroad money, and his forged documents, and his hired men, Richard Vance did not yet understand the most important thing about Evelyn Harper. She had never once in her life stayed where someone put her. They reached the eastern edge of the range on the morning of the 3rd day. Caleb had said 3 days minimum, and he had been right about the minimum part. The second day had cost them 4 hours, when a washed-out section of the back trail forced a detour that climbed higher than either of them had planned through terrain that required both hands and both feet, and left no room for conversation or anything else except the immediate negotiation of the next 10 feet of ground. Evelyn had not complained. She had not asked how much farther, or whether they could rest, or whether the detour meant they were lost. She had watched where Caleb put his hands, and she had put her hands in the same places, and she had kept moving. He had noticed. He noticed everything she was learning, but he filed it away rather than commenting on it, which she respected more than she could have explained. The 3rd morning she woke before him. That surprised her. She had assumed he woke first, always the kind of man whose internal clock ran on military timing and refused to be negotiated with. But she opened her eyes in the pre-dawn gray, and he was still Scout curled against his side, both of them breathing in the slow rhythm of genuine sleep. She lay there for a moment and watched him without meaning to, the lines of his face gone loose in a way they never were. During the day the hard angles softened just enough to show something younger underneath. She looked away, got up carefully, started the fire herself with the flint box she had watched him use twice and figured out by the 3rd attempt. When Caleb woke 20 minutes later to a fire already going and water already heating, he went still for one moment in a way that told her no one had done that for him in a long time. He didn't say anything about it. But when he handed her the first cup of coffee, he handed it to her first instead of pouring his own, and she understood that was his version of saying it. They moved at first light. The town of Bozeman appeared below them in the mid-morning spread across the valley floor, in the particular organized chaos of a frontier city that had grown faster than its own plans. She had been to Bozeman twice with her father. It had felt small to her, then provincial, compared to what her father described of the eastern cities he'd done business in. Now it looked like civilization itself, like a promise. "We don't go in together," Caleb said, stopping where the trail met the first road. She turned to look at him. "Why?" "Because Richard Vance has had 3 days. If he came back from the mountain without confirmation, he'd have men watching the roads into Bozeman." He looked at her directly. "And because you walking into town in trail boots 2 sizes too large with no coat and no bag will draw exactly the kind of attention you can't afford right now." She looked down at herself. He was not wrong. "What do you suggest?" "I go in first. I know a woman on the south end, Clara Briggs. She runs a boarding house. Decent, discreet, doesn't ask questions she doesn't need answers to." He paused. "I'll get you clothes, something that doesn't announce where you've been. Then we go to Hoskins. Together." He held her gaze. I'm not dropping you at the edge of town and riding away, Evelyn. She had not realized until he said it that she had been bracing for that possibility. The breath she released was longer than she intended. All right, she said. How long? Hour. Maybe less. He looked at Scout. He stays with you. Caleb. She stopped him. Be careful. He looked back at her. Something crossed his face, not surprise exactly, but the expression of a man who had received something he had stopped expecting. Always am, he said. He went down the road alone, and she sat on a boulder at the tree line with Scout pressed against her leg, and she did not let herself think about what happened if someone recognized him, or if someone had already been to Clara Briggs's boarding house asking questions, or if the hour turned into 2 and then 3 and then nothing. She did not let herself think about any of it. She watched the road and she breathed, and she reminded herself what she had told Caleb that first night. She always made another plan. She was still working on what the other plan would be when Scout's ears pricked forward and she saw Caleb coming back up the road with a bundle under his arm and a pace that said nothing had gone wrong. The relief hit her harder than she expected. She stood before she'd decided to stand. He came up the last stretch of road and held out the bundle without preamble. A plain day dress in dark blue, a coat that had been worn but was solid, and a pair of shoes that were closer to her size than the trail boots. She took them. There's a spring 20 feet that way, he said, nodding left without looking. Give yourself 10 minutes. She gave herself 8. When she came back, Caleb looked at her, the way he looked at everything, that full, steady assessment that didn't linger anywhere. It didn't need to. He nodded once. Better, he said. You look like a woman visiting an attorney, not a woman who just came off a mountain. That's exactly what I am, she said. Yes, he said. It is. They went into Bozeman. Meridian Street ran through the center of the commercial district, and Hoskins' office occupied the second floor of a building near the north end. A narrow staircase, a frosted glass door with the name lettered in black. She had been here once before at 15, sitting beside her father while Hoskins reviewed a land survey. She remembered a precise, careful man with ink-stained fingers, and the habit of reading every document twice before commenting on any of it. She went up the stairs with Caleb behind her and knocked. The voice that answered was older than she remembered, but the precision was still in it. Come. She opened the door. Obadiah Hoskins looked up from his desk. He was in his late 60s now, his hair gone fully white, his face more lined. But his eyes found her face and went sharp with recognition immediately, and then something else moved through them, something that looked like alarm. Miss Harper, he said. Mr. Hoskins? She closed the door behind her and Caleb. I need you to tell me that the original deed instrument still exists, the one my father had you draw up for the northern land holdings. I need you to tell me right now. Hoskins stood. His eyes went to Caleb, then back to her. Who is this man? Someone who helped me reach your office. Answer my question, Mr. Hoskins. The attorney was quiet for 3 seconds. She counted, and the expression on his face in those 3 seconds was the most frightening thing she had seen since she stood outside the study door and heard Richard Vance describe a wagon accident. Because it was the expression of a man who was deciding what to tell her. Mr. Hoskins, she said, and her voice came out very even the way her father's voice went very even when he was most serious. My fiancé had me driven into the Bitterroot Range in a storm and left there to die. My father is being slowly poisoned in his own home, and someone is attempting to fraudulently transfer an inheritance that my father spent 30 years building. She stepped forward. I am standing in your office because I believe you are an honest man. If I am wrong about that, tell me now, so I can stop wasting time I don't have. Hoskins stared at her. Then he sat back down, heavily, like his legs had decided before his mind had. They came to me, he said. 10 days ago. 2 men, one of them an attorney I didn't know. They had a deed transfer document. They said your father had executed it willingly, that you had agreed to the terms. He stopped, pressed his fingers to his desk. They asked me to certify it. Evelyn felt the ground shift under her. "Did you?" she asked. "No." His voice was firm. "I told them I needed to speak to your father directly. They said he was too ill for visitors." He looked up at her. That was when I became concerned. "Where is the original document?" Caleb spoke for the first time since they'd entered the office. His voice was quiet, but it carried. Hoskins looked at him, took his measure, looked back at Evelyn. "In the strongbox," he said, "where it has been since Gerald Harper asked me to hold it." The breath came out of her before she could manage it, long ragged, the relief of a woman who had been holding something very tight for 3 days and could finally just fractionally loosen her grip. "I need it," she said. "I know." Hoskins was already moving toward the far wall. "But Miss Harper, I also need you to know something." He stopped with his hand on the strongbox. "The men who came to me, the attorney with them, he told me something before he left." "What?" Hoskins turned to face her. His expression had the particular gravity of a man delivering information he wishes he didn't have. "He told me your father signed a revised will 2 weeks ago, not a deed transfer, a will, naming Margaret Harper as primary heir and Richard Vance as executor." He paused. "If that document is legitimate—" "It isn't," Evelyn said. "If it can be made to appear legitimate in front of a territorial judge, it supersedes the deed instrument regardless." Hoskins looked at her steadily. "You understand what I'm telling you?" She understood. She understood that the deed being intact was necessary, but not sufficient. That Richard had planned for the possibility of the deed surfacing. That he had built a second layer under the first, and under that layer, probably a third. She understood that she had 3 days on him, not the advantage she'd thought. "Who was the attorney?" Caleb asked. "Name of Farrell. Claude Farrell. He practices out of Helena." Caleb went still in a particular way. Evelyn caught it. "You know that name," she said. He took a beat. "Farrell's been connected to land fraud cases in the territorial courts for 2 years. Nothing proven, but connected." He looked at Hoskins. "You report this meeting. I sent a letter to the Territorial Land Office in Helena 3 days ago." Hoskins opened the strongbox. "I don't know if it's been received." "It's been received," Caleb said. "Question is whether anyone's acted on it." Hoskins withdrew the deed instrument, heavy paper folded, sealed with a wax impression that was still intact, and held it out to Evelyn. She took it with both hands. She had last seen this document when she was 22, sitting in this same office, while her father pressed it into the attorney's keeping and said, "This is for Evelyn. Whatever happens, this is for Evelyn." She held it now and thought about her father saying that, and she pressed the thought down hard because she could not afford to feel it yet. "Not here. Not now. I need to file an injunction," she said. "Today. Freezing the estate and contesting the revised will on grounds of undue influence and possible incapacity." "I've already drafted it," Hoskins said quietly. She looked up at him. "I drafted it 4 days ago," he said, "when the men came and I couldn't reach you and I didn't know where you were." His voice had something rough in it. "Your father was a good man, Miss Harper, and I've been an attorney in this territory for 30 years. I know what a fraudulent transfer looks like." He pushed the papers across the desk. "I just needed you alive to sign it." She sat down. She read every word, Caleb standing behind her, Hoskins across the desk, Scout sitting outside the door. They'd left cracked because the attorney had looked at the dog and decided he was less trouble than an argument. And then she picked up the pen and signed her name in the clean, firm hand her father had insisted she practice until it looked like a signature and not an apology. "File it today," she said, "within the hour." Hoskins took the papers. "But Miss Harper, the injunction freezes the estate and triggers a territorial review. That review could take weeks. In the meantime, Richard Vance is still in my father's house." "Yes." She stood. "Then I need to get to my father." "Evelyn." Caleb's voice was measured, careful. "If Vance gets word that the injunction was filed, He'll know I'm alive and I've been to Hoskins. Yes. She turned to face him. He'll know within a day. Probably less if he has someone watching this office. Caleb was quiet for a moment. She could see him running the calculation the same kind she was running, looking for the sequence that got them where they needed to go, without walking into a door someone had closed ahead of them. Then we don't go to the house, he said. We go to the sheriff. The county sheriff is a man named Aldous Breed, Hoskins said carefully. He and Richard Vance have had dinner together every month for the past year. Silence. Of course they have, Evelyn said. There's a federal marshal's office, Caleb said. Bozeman has had a deputy marshal stationed here since spring. Name of Garrett. I don't know him well, but I know he came from outside the territory. He's not Vance's man. You're sure? I'm not sure of anything today, Caleb said. But it's better odds than Breed. Hoskins was writing something down. He tore the paper from his pad and held it out an address on the east side of the commercial district. Marshal Garrett's office, and Miss Harper. He held on to the paper for one moment before releasing it. Go now, before word travels. They went. The street outside was mid-morning busy, wagons, foot traffic, the particular noise of a working frontier city that didn't slow down for anyone's crisis. She moved through it with Caleb beside her, and Scout at her left heel, and she kept her face forward, and her pace even, the way her father had taught her to move through a room full of people who were watching to see if she would flinch. She didn't flinch. She was halfway down the block when she heard her name. Not her full name, just Evelyn. Spoken in a voice she recognized. She stopped. Caleb stopped with her. She turned. The man standing 20 feet away on the boardwalk was not Richard Vance. He was younger, early 30s, dark-coated with the look of someone who had been in this town for several days waiting for something. He was one of Richard's men, not one of the two from the mountain, a different one. Someone she had seen at the estate but couldn't name. He was looking at her with an expression that was doing several things at once: surprise recognition and the rapid calculation of a man trying to decide what his next move was. His hand moved toward his coat. Caleb stepped forward. One step clean and immediate, placing himself between her and the man on the boardwalk with the kind of motion that didn't look like a threat and was entirely one. Morning, Caleb said. His voice was almost pleasant. The man's hand stopped. We're just heading to a meeting, Caleb continued in the same easy tone. Don't want to keep anyone waiting. The man's eyes went to Caleb, taking him in, reassessing, and then went back to Evelyn. The calculation was still running behind his eyes. She could see the moment it completed. He turned and walked in the opposite direction, fast. He's going to send word, she said. Yes. Caleb turned her by the elbow, not roughly, just decisively. We have about 20 minutes before someone with more authority than him shows up. Move. They moved. Marshal Garrett's office was on the far side of the commercial block, a plain door with a federal seal that looked recent, like it hadn't been there long enough to weather much. Caleb went in first. She followed. The man behind the desk was younger than she'd expected, mid-30s, light-eyed, with the particular watchfulness of someone whose job required him to assess strangers quickly and accurately. He looked at Caleb, then at her, then at Scout, then back at her. Help you, he said. My name is Evelyn Harper, she said. My father is Gerald Harper, railroad investor. Harper Land Holdings, Northern Territorial Grants. An attempt was made on my life 3 days ago at the direction of my fiancé, Richard Vance, and my stepmother, Margaret Harper. A fraudulent will has been filed in my father's name, and the man responsible has at minimum one associate in this town who just saw me on the street and is currently sending word of my whereabouts. She put Hoskins' deed instrument on his desk. I have a signed injunction being filed this hour by my father's attorney, Obadiah Hoskins, on Meridian Street, and I need federal protection for myself and access to my father before Richard Vance understands that I'm alive and gets there first. Garrett looked at the deed on his desk, looked at her face, looked at Caleb. You vouch for this, he said to Caleb. I found her half dead in the Bitterroot Range 3 nights ago, Caleb said. Everything she just told you is consistent with what I've seen. Garrett was quiet for 5 full seconds. Then he stood. Sit down, Miss Harper, he said. Tell me everything from the beginning. She sat. She told him. She told him faster and more efficiently than she had told anyone, cutting to the facts and sequencing them in the order that would be most immediately actionable, the way her father had taught her to make a case, not emotionally, but structurally, one fact supporting the next. When she finished, Garrett had written 3 pages of notes without looking up from his pad. He looked up now. Vance is a known figure in territorial business circles, he said. I've had no reason to look at him before this. He picked up the deed. But Farrell Claude. Farrell, I know that name. We've been building a case connected to land fraud in 2 other counties. He looked at her steadily. If Vance is connected to Farrell, this is bigger than your estate. I don't care how big it is, she said. I care about my father. I understand that. He stood. I have 2 deputies. I'm going to send one to your father's estate today under federal authority. Welfare check, document preservation. No confrontation with Vance unless he creates it. The other goes to Hoskins to confirm the injunction. He paused. Miss Harper, where you're concerned, you cannot go back to that house. Not today. Not until we have more standing. She opened her mouth. He's right, Caleb said from beside her. She closed her mouth, looked at Caleb. He was looking back at her with the particular steadiness she had come to read as, I'm not telling you what to do, I'm telling you what's true. Where do I go? She asked Garrett. Clara Briggs boarding house, Caleb said. South Side. She's discreet. Garrett nodded like he knew the name. Stay there. Don't move around the city alone. And Miss Harper. He picked up his hat. You did the right thing coming here. Vance is going to know within hours that you've been to this office. When he does, his options narrow considerably. And so do mine, she said. Yes, Garrett said, but his narrow toward panic. Yours narrow toward a courtroom. He looked at her with something that was almost a smile. I find that courtrooms tend to favor the living. They left the marshal's office, and the street was still busy and bright, and nothing about the world had changed except that inside her chest something had shifted. Not relief, not yet, but the feeling of having moved from one kind of ground to another. Softer ground, maybe. Ground that might hold. Caleb walked beside her toward the south side without speaking for half a block. You know what you just did, he said finally. I know. You just put your name on a federal record. Vance will know you're alive, and you've talked to a marshal by nightfall. I know that too. She kept walking. But Garrett was right. His options narrow. He can't run. He can't file the false will now without triggering immediate scrutiny. He can't... She stopped. A thought arrived that she had not thought before, and it hit her with a cold, specific force. He'll go to my father. Caleb stopped with her. If the options narrow, she said, and she heard her own voice going flat with the effort of keeping it controlled. If Richard Vance is cornered and he knows it, he goes to my father. He does what he's been planning to do from the beginning, and he does it now before Garrett's deputy arrives. Caleb was already moving, back toward Garrett's office, fast. She kept pace. They got to the door in under a minute, and Caleb pushed through it without knocking. Garrett looked up from his desk. The deputy you're sending to the Harper estate, Caleb said. Send him now, not today, right now. Garrett looked at Evelyn. She was already at the desk. My father is in danger tonight. If Vance knows the injunction has been filed and that I've spoken to you, he will not wait. He cannot afford to wait. Her voice was steady, and she was proud of it for being steady. Please. Garrett held her gaze for 1 second. Then he stood and went to the door and called his deputy's name into the street. She stood in the doorway of the marshal's office in a borrowed dress and trail-worn borrowed shoes, holding a deed that bore her name and her father's trust, and she watched a federal deputy mount his horse and ride hard toward the Harper estate. Her father was still alive. She believed that. She had to believe it, the way she had to believe the next step of ground would hold, not because she was certain, but because the alternative was a kind of darkness she refused to walk into. Caleb came to stand beside her. He didn't say anything. He just stood there. Scout pressed against her left leg. She put her hand on the dog's head without thinking about it, and felt the solid, warm reality of him under her palm, alive, present, uncomplicated in the way that only animals and truly honest people ever manage to be. "Thank you," she said. She wasn't saying it to the dog. "Don't thank me yet," Caleb said quietly. "We've started something today. We haven't finished it." "I know." "Vance isn't a man who accepts being cornered." "No," she said. "He isn't." She looked at the road the deputy had ridden down, already empty dust still settling. "But then again, neither am I." The boarding house on the south side of Bozeman smelled like biscuits and cedar, and the particular kind of quiet that belongs to a place where people come to recover from things they don't talk about. Clara Briggs was a compact woman in her 50s, with iron gray hair and the expression of someone who had heard every kind of story and stopped being surprised by any of them approximately 20 years ago. She looked at Evelyn, looked at Caleb, looked at Scout and said, "Rooms at the top of the stairs. Dog stays off the bed." That was the extent of her questions. Evelyn sat on the edge of the narrow bed in the room at the top of the stairs and felt for the first time since she had pressed herself against the hallway wall and heard Richard Vance's voice through a gap in a study door completely and utterly exhausted. Not the physical exhaustion of 3 days on the mountain, which had been real and considerable. This was the other kind, the kind that settles in when the immediate emergency has passed, and the body understands it is briefly allowed to stop performing. She did not let herself stop for long. Caleb had gone to get food and information in that order. He had told her to stay in the room. She had agreed, which surprised them both slightly. But she understood the logic. She was known now in this city to at least one of Vance's people, and moving around alone before Garrett had more standing was the kind of risk that felt like action, but was actually just exposure. So she sat, and she thought. The revised will was the problem. Hoskins' injunction froze the estate and challenged the transfer documents, but a revised will naming Margaret and Vance as primary inheritors operated on different legal ground. If Claude Farrell had drawn it up carefully, and a man connected to 2 counts of territorial land fraud would have drawn it up very carefully contesting, it required proof of incapacity or undue influence at the time of signing, which required medical testimony, which required a doctor willing to say in a territorial court that Gerald Harper had not been in sound mind when he signed. The Harper family doctor was a man named Clifton. He had been visiting her father every morning for 6 weeks. He had access. He had observation. And he had, she noted now, with a cold clarity she should have applied earlier, been recommended to her father by Margaret Harper herself, 18 months ago, when the previous doctor retired. She was still sitting with that thought when Caleb came back. He came through the door with food wrapped in paper and something in his expression that was doing its best to stay neutral and not fully succeeding. "What happened?" she said. Not a question. He set the food down. Garrett's deputy got to the estate. And, "Your father's alive." He said it first, and she closed her eyes for 1 second. But when the deputy arrived, Vance was already there, with Farrell. She opened her eyes. Farrell came from Helena in 3 days. "He was already in the county. Garrett thinks he's been here since before the men put you on the mountain." Caleb pulled the chair from the corner and sat. The deputy served the injunction paperwork on site. Vance accepted it, didn't argue, didn't resist. "That's worse," she said immediately. "Yes." Caleb held her gaze. A man who accepts an injunction without arguing is a man who thinks he doesn't need to argue. She stood, moved to the window, stopped herself from looking out of it because being visible from the street was not something she could afford. Old habit, she had always thought better moving. She stood in the center of the room instead. "The will," she said. "Garrett thinks the same thing. He's trying to get a copy of the document from the Territorial Records Office in Helena. It was filed 5 days ago." He paused. "Filed the day after you disappeared. He had it ready before I was put on the mountain, she said. He filed it the moment he thought I was dead. That's how it reads. Which means it was prepared weeks ago, probably while my father was still well enough to be... She stopped, made herself complete the thought. While my father was still well enough to be pressured into signing it. Caleb was quiet. The doctor, she said. Clifton. He recommended by Margaret. He's been with my father every morning for 6 weeks. Caleb, if my father is being given something to keep him confused, compliant, Clifton either knows about it or is responsible for it. That's a serious accusation. Everything about this is serious. She turned to face him. I need Garrett to get a doctor to examine my father. Not Clifton. Someone independent. Someone who can document what's in his system and whether his mental state at the time of signing was... She paused. Whether he was capable. I'll go back to Garrett, Caleb said. He was already standing. Wait. She crossed to him. Before you go, I need to ask you something. He stopped. She looked at him straight. How much of your life have I already disrupted? The question seemed to land differently than she'd intended, not as an apology, which it was, but as something he needed to actually consider. He looked at her for a moment. I wasn't doing anything that couldn't be interrupted, he said. That's not an answer. It's the only one I've got. He picked up his hat. I'll be back within the hour. He was back in 40 minutes. He came through the door and she read his face before he spoke better news. Not perfect news. The expression of a man who had achieved something partial. Garrett is sending for a territorial physician, he said. Independent federal appointment not connected to any local practice. He can be at the Harper estate by tomorrow morning. Tomorrow morning. She absorbed the timeline. And tonight, the deputy stays on site, federal presence. Vance can't move your father or remove documents without triggering immediate federal obstruction. He sat. It's not everything, but it holds the line until morning. She nodded. What about Farrell? Garrett sent a wire to the marshal's office in Helena an hour ago. The land fraud case connected to Farrell, there's an investigator already working it. Garrett's information about Vance may be exactly what that investigator needs to move. He looked at her. If Farrell is charged federally, any document he prepared is immediately under scrutiny, including the will. She felt the shape of it assembling slowly, piece by piece, the way a legal case actually built, not all at once, but incrementally, each fact mortared to the next. It could take weeks, she said. It could. My father doesn't have weeks. She said it plainly. Whatever has been given to him, if it's been ongoing for 6 weeks, his body is struggling. Every day matters. Caleb leaned forward. Then the most important thing that happens tomorrow is that independent physician getting in front of your father. If he can document the medical situation, Garrett can escalate the federal involvement. He held her gaze. One step. Tomorrow. That's the step we can take. She knew he was right. She also knew that knowing he was right did nothing for the thing sitting in her chest, the specific, helpless grief of a daughter who could not get to her father's bedside because getting there tonight might cost him the morning. He used to sing when he worked, she said. She hadn't planned to say it. It came out of the exhaustion and the specific hour, and the fact that Caleb Mercer was the kind of person it was possible to say true things to without preparing them first. In the mornings, when he was going through ledgers or reviewing survey maps, just quietly to himself, old songs. He didn't even notice he was doing it. She looked at her hands. I've been trying not to think about whether he's still doing that. Caleb was quiet for a long moment. Tell me about him, he said. She looked up. You've told me what he built, Caleb said. Tell me who he is. She had not expected that. She had not expected the specific gentleness of it. Not pity, not comfort in the performed sense, but genuine interest. The question of a man who understood that the difference between what someone built and who they were was sometimes the distance between a legacy and a life. She told him. She talked about her father, The way she had not let herself talk about him since the night she'd heard his death being arranged, not as an estate to be preserved or a victim to be protected, but as Gerald Harper himself. The man who had laughed too loud at his own jokes and been embarrassed about it. Who had kept every letter she'd ever written him in a box under his desk. Who had driven a surveying team through 3 weeks of bad weather because he had promised a settlement community a rail connection and did not make promises he didn't intend to keep. Caleb listened the same way he listened to everything fully, without interrupting, without performing attention, just actually present. When she finished, the room was quieter in a different way than before. "He sounds like a man worth fighting for," Caleb said. "He is." She met his eyes. "He's worth every bit of this." Something passed between them in the silence that followed, not a word, not a gesture, but the particular shift that happens between two people when they have been through enough together that the space between them has changed its nature. It was not romantic in the way of songs or stories. It was more fundamental than that. It was the recognition that had been building across 3 days of mountain trail and crisis and honesty. The understanding that this person, this specific person sitting across from you in a small room at the end of an impossible week, was someone you did not need to perform for. Caleb looked away first. He looked toward the door in the thoughtful way of a man recalibrating. "You should eat," he said. "The food's getting cold." She almost laughed. The almost was real. The impulse was genuine, arriving from somewhere under the exhaustion, like proof that she was still entirely herself. She ate. They didn't talk much through the meal. Scout was given a portion without discussion. The food was plain and sufficient, and the room was quiet. And for approximately 40 minutes, the situation was simply this: 2 people and a dog in a boarding house room, eating alive with morning coming. It was Clara Briggs who ended it. She knocked once and opened the door with the proprietary efficiency of a woman in her own house. She looked at Evelyn. "Young man downstairs," she said. "Federal deputy. Says Marshal Garrett needs Miss Harper at his office. Now." The word now landed with a specific weight. Evelyn was on her feet before Clara finished the sentence. Caleb was a half-step behind her. "What's happened?" Evelyn asked the deputy at the foot of the stairs. He was young, younger than she'd noticed in the marshal's office, the kind of young that shows under pressure. "Ma'am," he said. "The man at your father's estate, Vance. He's left." "Left the estate?" "Yes, ma'am. About an hour ago. With the woman your stepmother. Both of them. Took a wagon north." She stared at him. "North? North Road, ma'am." Caleb was beside her, and she felt him go still in the way she now recognized the stillness of a man calculating fast. "He's running," Caleb said. "He can't run," she said. "He's been served the injunction. If he leaves the territory, he knows the federal case is building," Caleb said. "He's not running permanently. He's running to regroup, somewhere outside Garrett's immediate reach where he can reconsider his options." He turned to the deputy. "How long ago did he leave?" "Hour, like I said. Maybe a little more." "What's north?" Evelyn asked. She was asking Caleb. "Several things. But if he's going far enough, he hits the Canadian boundary territory. Federal jurisdiction gets complicated up there." He looked at her. "Or he's going to one of the mining settlements. There are magistrates in those settlements that operate outside the territorial court system." "He has the will document," she said. "Farrell's copy. If he gets it in front of a magistrate in a settlement court before Garrett can get a federal stay, it wouldn't be binding," Caleb said. "Not in any court that matters. It doesn't need to be binding. It needs to be enough to give him time to transfer assets that aren't covered by the injunction." She was already moving toward the door. "Garrett. We need Garrett now." Garrett was at his desk when they came through the door, and she could see from the way he looked up that he already knew had known before. The deputy came for her, had been working the problem since the moment he got word. "Sit down," he said. "He's going north," she said. She didn't sit. "I know where he's going." Garrett folded his hands on the desk. "There's a settlement called Ridgecall 40 miles north. It has a justice of the peace who has been flexible in his interpretations of territorial law for the better part of a decade. He looked at her steadily. If Vance gets a sympathetic hearing there before I can get a federal stay in place, he can tie up certain Harper assets in ways that take months to untangle. Then go after him, she said. I have 2 deputies. One is at your father's estate, the other is standing behind you. He held her gaze. I have sent a wire to the Territorial Marshal's office requesting additional authority and personnel. That request will be answered, but not tonight. The silence in the room was the particular kind that follows a statement of limitation when the resources do not match the emergency, and everyone in the room knows it, and no one wants to be the first to say what comes next. Caleb spoke. I know Ridge Call, he said. I know the roads north. I can cover that distance in less time than a wagon. He looked at Garrett. If I ride tonight, I reach Ridge Call before Vance does. Garrett looked at him. You're not a federal officer. No. Caleb held his gaze. But I'm a man who can get there first and make sure a justice of the peace understands the full legal situation before he's presented with a one-sided account of it. That's not— I know what it's not, Caleb said. I'm asking you what it is. Is it useful? Garrett was quiet for 5 seconds. If the justice of the peace at Ridge Call declines to hear the matter pending federal review, he said carefully, that is a legally valid outcome. Any private citizen who happened to be present and provided accurate information about an active federal injunction would not be acting improperly. Caleb picked up his hat. I'm going with him, Evelyn said. No, said Caleb and Garrett simultaneously. She looked at both of them. I am the party of legal interest in this matter. My presence. Your presence on a night road between here and Ridge Call, while Richard Vance has men in this territory, is not something I can protect, Garrett said. Ma'am, you are the only person who can testify to everything that has happened. I need you alive and unharmed for the case I'm building. Please. She looked at Caleb. He looked back at her. His expression said everything Garrett had said, and also one more thing. Something quieter. Something that was just between the two of them after 3 days of ground covered and truths told in firelight. I'll come back, he said. Not, I'll be fine. Not a reassurance about himself. He would come back. To her. That was what he said. She held his gaze for one long moment. Be careful, she said. I always am. He said it the same way he'd said it the first time she'd told him that 2 days ago at the edge of the mountain before he'd gone into Bozeman alone. But it landed differently now. Heavier. More specific. He left. She stood in Garrett's office and listened to the sound of his horse leaving the street, and she was more frightened than she had been on the mountain in the storm. More frightened than she had been in the closed wagon, or at the rock face, or anywhere in the last 3 days. Because on the mountain, the danger had been to her, and she had always been able to bear the danger when it was hers. This was different. Miss Harper, Garrett said. She turned. Sit down, he said, gently this time. I need your full account of everything from the beginning in as much detail as you can give me. I'm going to write it down and have you sign it tonight. He picked up his pen. It's going to be the cornerstone of the federal case. I need it complete. She sat down. She told him everything. Again. But this time it was different from the first telling. This time it was formal. It was official. It was being written in the hand of a federal officer and would carry the weight of that. This time, every word she spoke was a brick in a structure that was going to outlast her fear and outlast Richard Vance's planning, and outlast the specific cruelty of men who thought that because they controlled the documents, they controlled the truth. She talked for 2 hours. When she signed the last page, the night outside was full dark. Garrett blotted the ink. You're a precise woman, Miss Harper. My father taught me that facts are the only currency that can't be counterfeited, she said. Garrett looked at her for a moment, with what might have been admiration quickly professionalized. Go back to the boarding house. Stay there. I'll send word the moment I hear from Mercer. She went back. She climbed the stairs. She sat on the edge of the bed in the narrow room that smelled like cedar and listened to the night outside and thought about Caleb riding north in the dark on a road he knew, because he had spent 4 years learning every road in this territory. Learning them the way a man learns things, when the learning itself is the point, when there is no one waiting at home to report back to. There was something waiting for him now. She acknowledged that to herself, sitting on the edge of that boarding house bed with her hands folded in her lap, and the deed document on the table beside her. She acknowledged it plainly, the way she had been trying to do everything in the last 3 days, without performance, without managing it into something more comfortable. She cared whether Caleb Mercer came back, not as a resource, not as an ally, though he was both. As the specific person he was, the man who had said, try when she was on the ground in the storm, who had handed her coffee first, who had asked her to tell him about her father, and then actually listened. Who had placed himself between her and a threat on a Bozeman street, with a single clean step and no drama whatsoever. She cared. She let herself know it. Then she lay down on the narrow bed and stared at the ceiling and waited for morning, which was going to arrive regardless of what she felt about it and would require her to be ready, which she intended to be. Scout jumped up beside her despite Clara Briggs's instructions about the bed, and she did not push him off. She put her hand on his back and felt him breathe, and she held on to the fact that Caleb had said he would come back. And Caleb Mercer, in 3 days of close observation, had not said a single thing he didn't mean. The night passed. The first gray light of morning was just beginning when she heard boots on the stairs. The particular rhythm she had learned to recognize over 3 days of mountain trail, even-paced, unhurried. The walk of a man who didn't waste energy on urgency he didn't need. Scout lifted his head. She was already sitting up when Caleb opened the door. He looked tired in the way the mountain hadn't made him look tired, the specific tiredness of a night ridden fast on purpose. But he was intact. He was present. And the look on his face was not victory, but something close to it. "Ridge call," he said, coming through the door. "Tell me. I got there 2 hours before the wagon." He sat in the chair, hat in hand. The justice of the peace is a man named Holbrook. He's flexible, like Garrett said. But he's not corrupt. There's a difference. He looked at her. "I told him about the injunction, about Farrell, about the federal involvement. I told him that any hearing he conducted in this matter would be subject to immediate review and that a federal marshal was actively building a case." He paused. When Vance arrived and presented the will document, Holbrook told him he would not hear the matter pending federal determination. She let that land. "Vance argued," Caleb continued, "for about 20 minutes. Holbrook didn't move. He set his hat on his knee. Then Vance did something I didn't expect." She waited. "He asked Holbrook to witness a new document," Caleb said. "Not the will, something else. A personal conveyance, an attempt to transfer a specific parcel of Harper land directly to himself, outside the estate, outside the injunction." His voice was even, but something in it had gone careful. "He claimed your father had signed it 3 weeks ago." "My father didn't sign anything 3 weeks ago that I didn't know about. I know that. Holbrook didn't know it. But the document had a signature, a notarization, and a date." He looked at her directly. Holbrook agreed to witness it. The coldness came back, sharp and immediate. "That parcel," she said. "The Northern Grant. The one your father conveyed to you privately through Hoskins." Caleb held her gaze. "If that conveyance is legitimate, it supersedes the deed Hoskins holds. It doesn't go through the estate. It doesn't fall under the injunction." She understood. The full structure of it, the thing Richard Vance had been building all along, not one plan, but 4 layered under each other like a man who had planned for every form of failure, who had prepared a document for every contingency, who had never believed he needed Evelyn's cooperation because he had always intended to make her cooperation irrelevant. She stood. "Hoskins," she said. "I need to get to Hoskins right now. If the original deed instrument from 3 years ago is in his strongbox, with a date that predates Vance's document by 3 years. "It does," Caleb said. She stopped. "I stopped at Hoskins' office on my way back this morning," he said. "He was already there. He'd heard from Garrett overnight. He reached inside his coat and withdrew a document folded official, bearing a seal she recognized as Hoskins' notarial mark. He prepared an affidavit of prior instrument. It documents the original deed, the date of execution, and the unbroken chain of custody in his strongbox. He held it out to her. Vance's document can't supersede something that was legally executed 3 years before it was written. She took the paper. She held it. She stood in the middle of that small boarding house room in Clara Briggs' cedar-smelling house, with dawn coming through the gap under the door, and an affidavit in her hands that meant Richard Vance had just played his last card and lost it, and she felt something move through her that was too large and too complicated to name grief and relief and fury, and something that was starting very slowly to feel like ground under her feet again. "He has nothing left," she said. "He has the will," Caleb said. "But without the land conveyance, the will is a document about an estate that's already frozen, being reviewed by federal authority, with a medical examination of the signatory ordered for this morning." He paused. "He has a document and no leverage." She looked at him. He was watching her with that steady, particular attention that she had come to understand was just how he looked at things that mattered to him. "You rode through the night," she said. "I did. You went to Hoskins before you came here." "Seemed like the right order. You could have sent word." "Word takes time," he said simply. "You'd been waiting long enough." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about what she had acknowledged to herself in the dark, that she cared whether he came back. She thought about how that felt now that he had. "Caleb," she said. He waited. "When this is over." She stopped, started differently. "I don't know what comes after this. I don't know what the estate looks like when this is finished, or what my father's condition will be, or how long the federal case takes, or what my life looks like on the other side of all of it." She held his gaze. "But I know that I do not want to go through the other side of it without—" She stopped again, made herself finish. "Without knowing where you are." The room was very quiet. Caleb looked at her. He had the expression of a man who had spent 4 years on a mountain arranging his life so that it didn't include this kind of moment, not from coldness, but from a kind of long-practiced self-protection that had made sense in a different chapter, and who was discovering, sitting in a boarding house chair at dawn with his hat on his knee, that the arrangement no longer held. "I reckon," he said slowly, "that's something we can figure out. Not a declaration, not a performance. Just a man telling the truth in the plainest language available to him. It was enough. It was more than enough." Outside, Bozeman was waking up. The day that would decide everything was beginning, and Evelyn Harper, who had been left on a mountain to die 5 days ago, and had walked out of the storm and through 40 miles of back-range terrain, and into a federal marshal's office with nothing but a deed, and the absolute refusal to stay where someone put her, was ready for it. Marshal Garrett arrived at the boarding house at 7 in the morning, with his deputy behind him, and the particular expression of a man who had been awake all night and had news that cut both ways. Evelyn read his face before he spoke. She had gotten good at reading faces in the last 5 days. She stood in the doorway of the boarding house parlor and waited. "The territorial physician reached your father this morning," Garrett said. "Dr. Ames. He examined Gerald Harper for 2 hours. And—" Garrett glanced at Caleb, who was standing to her left in the way he had positioned himself for 5 days now, not in front of her, not behind her, but beside her. Level. "Your father is alive and conscious," Garrett said. "Dr. Ames found evidence of prolonged laudanum administration. Higher doses than any legitimate medical treatment would require. The effect on a man your father's age over 6 weeks." He stopped. Chose his words. "It explains his deterioration, his confusion, his compliance with documents he would not have signed in sound mind." She held herself very still. "Clifton," she said. "Dr. Ames found the medication in Clifton's bag, not prescribed, not documented, hidden in a secondary case beneath his instruments." Garrett's voice went flat in the way it did when facts were so clean they didn't need emphasis. "Clifton has been taken into federal custody this morning." Caleb made a sound beside her, not quite a word, just the brief exhale of a man who had suspected and been confirmed. "My father," she said. "When can I see him?" "That's why I'm here," Garrett said. "Dr. Ames says he's stable. The laudanum is clearing. He paused. "He's been asking for you." She didn't remember deciding to move. She was simply moving, coat already on, hat already in hand, through the parlor and toward the door, with Caleb a step behind and Garrett falling into pace beside her. "Vance," she said as they went. "Returned to Bozeman this morning," Garrett said. "He knows the Ridge Call conveyance failed. He knows Holbrook declined to act. He kept pace with her. He also knows that Clifton is in custody, which means he knows we have medical evidence of what was done to your father. He'll be preparing to run. He'll try." Garrett's voice was satisfied in a measured way. "I have a federal warrant for Richard Vance's arrest, signed by the territorial judge in Helena as of 6 o'clock this morning. My deputy is executing it as we speak." He looked at her. "Farrell is already in custody in Helena. He gave a statement last night. Named Vance as the primary architect of the scheme within the first 20 minutes of questioning." She stopped walking, turned to look at Garrett fully. "Farrell gave Vance up," she said. "Farrell is not a courageous man," Garrett said simply. "He's a man who saw which direction the current was moving and started swimming." Something moved through her, not satisfaction exactly, but the specific sensation of a structure she had been holding up with her bare hands for 5 days finally finding its own foundation. She let herself feel it for exactly 3 seconds. Then she started walking again. The Harper estate looked the same from the outside. Same iron gate, same gravel drive, same summer light on the front windows. She had walked through that gate thousands of times in her life. This morning she walked through it differently, not as the heir who lived here, not as the daughter who had grown up here, but as the woman who had left through the garden gate 5 nights ago with 2 men at her arm and come back through the front with a federal marshal beside her and a mountain cowboy at her shoulder. The deputy at the door stepped aside without a word. She went upstairs. Her father's room smelled different than it had 5 days ago. The thick medicinal sweetness that she had attributed to illness was already beginning to clear, replaced by something cleaner. The curtains were open. The summer light came in. Gerald Harper was propped against his pillows with his eyes open. He turned his head when she came through the door. For a moment, just one brief and total, his face did what faces do when they have been frightened for a long time, and the thing they were frightened about does not happen. It collapsed inward. Relief and grief and love all at once, the expression of a man who had spent 5 days in a medicated confusion that was not quite sleep and not quite waking, and had through it understood enough to be afraid. "Evelyn," he said. His voice was thin, but it was his voice. She crossed the room and sat on the edge of the bed and took his hand, both of her hands around his one, and did not say anything for a moment, because there was nothing that needed to be said before this. "Papa," she said finally, "I couldn't—" He stopped. His jaw worked. "I tried to warn you. The letter. I wrote the letter, and I didn't know if Margaret was there, and I didn't know if you understood what I was—" "I understood," she said. "I understood." He closed his eyes. "She told me you'd gone, that you'd left, that you didn't want—" He stopped again. "I didn't believe it. I told myself I didn't believe it. You were right not to." She held his hand tighter. "I'm here, Papa. I'm here, and Clifton is in federal custody, and Vance has been arrested, and Hoskins' injunction is holding." She said each piece clearly in order, the way she would have presented a case, the way he had taught her. "It's going to be all right. You're going to be all right." He opened his eyes. They were clearer than they had been in weeks. She could see the return of the sharpness that was distinctly his, the intelligence that had built a railroad from survey maps and handshake deals, and the particular stubborn confidence of a man who believed that if he was right about the land, the money would follow. "How?" he said. She told him. The condensed version, the mountain Caleb Bozeman, Garrett Ridgecall Hoskins Farrell. She told it cleanly and without editorializing because he deserved facts, and she was her father's daughter. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "The man who found you," he said. "On the mountain. Caleb Mercer." "Where is he now?" "Downstairs," she said. Her father, looked at her. His eyes were doing their particular reading, the look he used when he was assessing something he needed to understand fully before he committed to an opinion about it. "I'd like to meet him," Gerald said. She went to the door and spoke to Caleb, who had been waiting in the hallway with the same quality of patience he brought to everything. Not restless, not hovering, simply present and available without demanding to be included. He came in. He took off his hat when he entered the room, stood at a respectful distance from the bed, looked at Gerald Harper with the same direct assessment he brought to everything, and she saw her father doing the same. Two men taking each other's measure in the honest, unhurried way of people who didn't have time for anything less. "Mr. Mercer," her father said. "Sir," Caleb said. "My daughter tells me you carried her out of a storm." "Scout found her. I followed him." Her father's eyes moved to the dog sitting in the doorway, decided against commenting on the presence of a dog in the bedroom, and returned to Caleb. "She also tells me you rode through the night to stop a man from stealing what's hers." Seemed like the right thing to do. Gerald was quiet for a moment. "Are you a man who does the right thing often?" "I try to," Caleb said. "Don't always manage it, but I try." Something moved through her father's face, the specific warmth of a man recognizing a quality he had always considered the most important one and finding it where he hadn't expected to look. "Sit down, Mr. Mercer," Gerald said. "I owe you more than a handshake from a bed, but for now, a handshake from a bed is what I've got." Caleb crossed the room and shook his hand. Her father held it a moment longer than a handshake required. "Thank you," Gerald Harper said, plainly, without decoration. "Yes, sir," Caleb said. She stood by the window and watched the two of them, and felt something in her chest settle into a place it had not occupied before. Not a resolution of everything, because everything was far from resolved. The federal case would take months. Her father's recovery would take longer. The estate would require untangling that would consume attorneys and court dates well into the following year. None of that was finished. But this specific moment, this room, her father's hand in Caleb's, sunlight through a window that had been curtained for 6 weeks, this was real, and it was hers, and no one had given it to her. She had walked out of a storm and come back for it. The knock at the bedroom door came from Garrett's deputy. His face when she opened it told her before he spoke. "Vance," she said. "Ma'am?" The deputy had the look of someone delivering information he found personally satisfying, but was keeping professional about. "Richard Vance was taken into federal custody 40 minutes ago at the Northern Road. He was attempting to leave the territory with 2 trunks of documents." He paused. "Marshal Garrett thought you'd want to know immediately." She held the door for a moment. "Margaret," she asked. "Mrs. Harper was found at the estate when the deputy arrived this morning. She's been questioned." He shifted. "She's cooperating, ma'am, extensively." She almost smiled. Margaret Harper, who had operated through whispered conversations and careful paperwork for 4 years, had apparently decided that cooperation was preferable to whatever came next. The irony of it, the woman who had arranged everything in the shadows, deciding that the light was preferable when the alternative was a federal charge settled somewhere that was not forgiveness, but was the beginning of understanding why people did what they did. "Thank you," she said to the deputy. She closed the door. She turned back into the room. Her father was watching her. Caleb was watching her. "He's in custody," she said. Her father closed his eyes. Not from weakness this time. From the particular relief of a man who has been carrying a weight he couldn't articulate and has been permitted to set it down. "Good," he said quietly. Just that. One word. Good. The next week moved differently than the week before. It not slowly, but with the particular purposeful pace of things being dismantled and rebuilt in the correct order. Dr. Ames came every morning, and the laudanum cleared from Gerald Harper's system day by day in a progression that was not dramatic, but was steady, and steady was everything. He sat up on the third day. He walked to the window on the fifth. He asked for his survey maps on the sixth, and Evelyn brought them and sat beside him while he looked at them, and some essential version of himself came back into his eyes. Garrett worked the federal case with the methodical thoroughness of a man who had been handed exactly the evidence he needed and intended to use every piece of it. Farrell's statement connected Vance to 3 separate land fraud schemes across the territory. The Harper estate was the largest and the most recent, but not the first. The territorial judge in Helena ordered a full review. The Harper estate injunction held. Hoskins filed additional documentation every other day, with the precision of a man who had been waiting for an opportunity to be useful and was not going to waste it. Margaret Harper's cooperation earned her a reduced position in the proceedings and the opportunity to leave the estate with what she had arrived with 4 years ago, which was not nothing and was not enough to argue about. She left on a Tuesday without speaking to Evelyn. Evelyn watched her go from the upstairs window and felt nothing complicated about it. Just the clean, factual recognition that some things end, not with confrontation, but with conclusion. Margaret had made her choices. The choices had not worked. She was leaving. That was the complete story. Caleb had taken a room at Clara Briggs' boarding house for the week. He came to the estate every day, at no particular time, with no particular announcement. He sat with Gerald when Gerald wanted company, and sat with Evelyn when she needed to talk through the legal developments, and sat with Scout in the garden when neither of them needed anything specific. He was useful in the practical sense. There were things that needed doing on the estate property that had been neglected, and he did them without being asked and without making a production of doing them. He was also useful in the less practical sense, the sense that is harder to name. He was simply there, which turned out to be exactly what was needed. On the 8th day, Evelyn found him in the estate garden in the late afternoon. Scout was somewhere in the property. The day had gone warm in the particular way of summer that suggests it is aware of its own abundance and is not apologizing for it. "You've been staying longer each day," she said. He looked up from what he was doing, fixing a gate hinge that had been loose for what looked like a year. "Is that a problem?" he asked. "No," she said. "It's an observation." He went back to the hinge. She sat on the garden bench that her mother had chosen 20 years ago and watched him work and let the silence be the comfortable kind it had become. Not the silence of two people avoiding something, but the silence of two people who had said the important things and were no longer in a hurry about the rest. "What happens to your cabin?" she asked. He considered. "It'll keep. You've been away from it for over a week. It's survived 4 years of me being in it," he said. "It'll survive a week of me not." She looked at him. "Caleb." He set the tool down and turned to face her. "I'm not going to be indirect about this," she said. "I've used up my supply of indirectness." He waited. "I don't know what the next months look like," she said. "The case, the estate, my father's recovery, there's a great deal of it, and none of it is simple. I know that." She held his gaze. "But I also know that I spent 5 days crossing a mountain and a city and a courtroom's worth of legal ground, and the one constant in all of it was you. And I don't want that to stop being true just because the emergency is over." He was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of reluctance. The quiet of a man taking something seriously. "The cabin's not going anywhere," he said. "But it doesn't have to be all I've got." He looked at her in the direct, unhurried way that was entirely him. "I reckon I've been living small on purpose for a long time. Seemed safer." "And now," she said. He picked up his hat, turned it once in his hands. "Now I'm thinking that small might just be small." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the woman she had been 10 days ago, the woman who had thought she knew the shape of her life and had been shown in the space of one evening how entirely wrong she was. That woman had signed documents without reading them closely enough, had accepted explanations that didn't add up because accepting them was easier than the alternative, had planned a future with a man she now understood she had never truly known. She was not that woman anymore. She was the woman who had stood in a storm and taken a stranger's hand and gotten up. who had walked 40 miles of mountain trail in boots 2 sizes too large, who had walked into a federal marshal's office with nothing but a deed, and told the truth with enough precision that it had become the foundation of a federal case. She was her father's daughter all the way through, and she had simply needed a mountain to prove it to herself. "Caleb," she said. "Evelyn," he said. Just that. Just each other's names spoken plain. It was enough. It had always been enough with him. The federal hearing was scheduled for 6 weeks out. Garrett came to the estate 3 days before to walk Evelyn through her testimony. What to say in what order, with what documentation supporting each claim. She didn't need much coaching. She had been preparing the sequence in her head since the night she'd dictated her account in his office, and she delivered it back to him with a precision that made him put his pen down halfway through and simply listen. "You'd have made a good attorney," he said when she finished. "I'd have made a better one than Farrell," she said, "but that's not saying much." Garrett almost smiled. Her father came downstairs for the first time on the day of the hearing. He was thinner than he had been, and he moved more carefully, and he leaned on the banister coming down in a way he never had before. But he was dressed in the suit he wore to business meetings, the dark wool one, the one that meant he considered what was happening to be serious, and his eyes were clear, and his jaw was set in the particular way that meant Gerald Harper had decided something and intended to see it through. Evelyn met him at the bottom of the stairs. "You don't have to come," she said. "I know I don't have to," he said. "I want to." She offered her arm. He took it. They walked into the territorial court building together. The hearing room was larger than she had expected, and more crowded. Territorial land fraud, involving a figure of Vance's business standing, had drawn attention from people who monitored these things. Attorneys and investors and railroad men who needed to understand what the outcome meant for their own dealings. She walked through them with her father on her arm and Caleb behind her and Hoskins to her right, with a case file that had grown to approximately 4 inches thick, and she felt every eye in the room and let them look. Richard Vance sat at the respondent's table with 2 attorneys she didn't recognize. He was well dressed as always. His expression was the controlled, careful blankness of a man who had decided that the only position left to him was composure. He glanced at her when she came in. She met his eyes. She did not look away first. She sat down. The judge, a woman which Evelyn noted with the particular awareness of someone who understood what that meant in a territorial court in this era and what it had cost to get here, called the proceeding to order, with a precision that established immediately that this courtroom was hers and the facts were what mattered in it. Evelyn testified for 3 hours. She had told the story before to Caleb to Garrett in her signed statement to her father in his bedroom. She had told it in fragments, and in full, and in the middle of emergencies, and at the end of them. But she had never told it here formally in front of the people who had the authority to make it mean something permanent. She told it now. She told it the way her father had taught her to make a case with facts in sequence, each one supported, each one clean. She told it the way Caleb had listened to it on the first night without performance, without managing the emotional weight, just the truth in the order it had happened. When Vance's attorneys cross-examined her, they were looking for inconsistency. They didn't find any. She had told the truth too many times to be inconsistent. The truth was its own consistency. Farrell's testimony came after hers. He told it, looking at the table which told the room everything it needed to know about the difference between a man who had done something and a man who was ashamed of it. Clifton testified under immunity. His voice shook. She did not feel sorry for him. The judge recessed for 2 hours. When she came back, the room went quiet in the immediate way of rooms that understand something definitive is about to happen. The judgment was thorough, clear, and complete. The fraudulent will was voided. The transfer documents prepared by Farrell were ruled invalid. The original deed instrument held in Hoskins' strongbox for 3 years was confirmed as the controlling instrument for the Northern Land Holdings. The Harper estate injunction was made permanent, pending the conclusion of the criminal proceedings. Richard Vance was remanded into federal custody on charges of fraud, conspiracy, and attempted murder. That last charge, the one that had no legal wiggle room because Garrett had found the 2 men from the mountain, and one of them presented with the full weight of federal involvement, had given a statement before the sun set on the day he was found. Margaret Harper received a formal censure and the terms of her exit from the estate, which she had already accepted and which did not require a second discussion. The judge looked up from her papers at the end and surveyed the room. "This court finds in favor of Miss Evelyn Harper," she said. "In full." In full. 2 words. Evelyn sat with them. Beside her, her father exhaled the long, complete exhale of a man releasing something he had been carrying since the night he had understood what was being done in his name, and had been too compromised to stop it. She put her hand over his on the table. Hoskins was already organizing his papers, with the satisfied efficiency of a man who had done exactly what he was put on this earth to do. Caleb was behind her. She didn't have to look to know it. She knew the particular quality of his presence the way she knew the sound of the mountain after the storm had passed, the specific quiet of something that had proven itself enduring. She looked at Vance. He was being guided toward the door by the federal deputy. His composure had held through the judgment she had to give him, but it had gone thin at the edges the way composure does when the thing it was protecting against has finally definitively arrived. He looked at her once more as he passed. She didn't know what he expected to see in her face. Whatever it was, she didn't give it to him. She gave him nothing. He had already taken everything from her that he was going to take. Outside the courthouse, the afternoon was full summer, the particular abundance of the season, all light and warmth, and the specific aliveness of a world that was doing its business regardless of human drama. She stood on the steps with her father beside her and Caleb behind, and Hoskins shaking her hand with both of his, and saying things she would remember later when she had room to appreciate them. Her father looked out at the street. "Well," Gerald Harper said. She looked at him. He looked back at her. His eyes were the eyes she remembered from before. Sharp warm, the eyes of the man who had told her since she was 7 years old that everything he built was hers, who had kept every letter she'd written him in a box under his desk, who had sung to himself over survey maps in the early morning. "Well," she said. He put his hand on her arm, patted it once. "Your mother would have said something elegant about this moment." "What would you say?" He thought about it. "I'd say you did it right." He looked at her steadily. "You did every bit of it right." She held that. She let herself hold it completely. Then she turned and looked at Caleb, who was standing at the bottom of the steps with Scout beside him and his hat in his hand, and the afternoon light finding him the way light finds things that are solid and real and where they are supposed to be. "The cabin," she said. He looked up. "You said it doesn't have to be all you've got." She came down the steps toward him. "I meant what I said in the garden." "I know you did," he said. "I meant what I said, too." She stopped on the last step, which put them at the same level, and she looked at him straight in the way she had been looking at things since the night she had stood in a storm and understood that she was not going to survive it by being careful. "Then we figure it out," she said. "We figure it out," he agreed. Scout pressed against her leg. She put her hand on his head. Caleb's hand came to rest beside hers a half-second after, unhurried and deliberate. She looked at him. He looked at her. No storm, no mountain, no men on the road or documents to contest or emergencies to navigate. Just this 2 people standing on courthouse steps in summer light, having come through the kind of thing that shows you exactly who someone is, having seen each other plain. Her father's hand found her shoulder from behind, brief and solid. Hoskins said something about paperwork, and she said she would be at his office in the morning, and she meant it, and she would handle it, and it would be fine, all of it, because she was Evelyn Harper, and she was her father's daughter, and she had walked out of a mountain storm with nothing and built something true from the ground up, and she knew now, in the particular unshakable way you only know things you have proven to yourself, that she could build anything. Gerald Harper lived. Richard Vance went to federal prison, where the territorial judge's ruling followed him with the thoroughness of justice that has been fully documented. Claude Farrell lost his license and his freedom in that order. The Harper estate, restored to its rightful inheritance, became something different than it had been under the weight of fraud and fear. It became itself, which was what it had always been meant to be. Hoskins retired 2 years later, with the satisfaction of a man who had done his best work at the end of his career. Garrett made territorial marshal the following spring. He sent Evelyn a note that said, "Only you were precise. It mattered." She kept it. Caleb Mercer did not go back to the mountain alone. He went with Evelyn, who had decided that the estate would run itself under capable management for 1 week, while she learned what the Bitterroot Range looked like in summer, without a storm, and without men chasing her down it. She learned what it looked like in the company of a man who moved through it like he belonged there, and had decided with the particular deliberate certainty of someone who did not make decisions carelessly, that belonging somewhere and belonging to someone were not incompatible things. Scout ran ahead of them on the trail, and doubled back, and ran ahead again, with the uncomplicated joy of a dog who had always known from the moment he found her in the snow that this was exactly how it was supposed to go. Evelyn Harper had been left on a mountain to die. She had come back with the truth, a deed, a federal case, her father's life, and the knowledge earned and absolute and entirely hers, that the woman she was now was the woman she had always been waiting to become. No one would ever put her down in the dark again.